So tell me about yourself.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, my initial background is academia, right? So I started off with a law degree, converted to a maths, so I became a maths teacher, then did an MA in philosophy. I was doing my PhD in philosophy before everything started kicking off on Twitter. And so I've paused that because of basically the Zionists. I think there's a high likelihood that they would have ensured that I don't pass. So my background is actually Islamic philosophy and theology, right? I have a decent amount of knowledge on that, Islamic law, as well as hermeneutics in terms of epistemology, in terms of hadith. So that's my background. And then on Twitter, I blew up because what happened was I just decided like, look, okay, let me try Twitter. And as soon as I came on it, Andrew Tate got arrested, right? With them false allegations. And so I was the only person who provided a different perspective. So like basically trying to demonstrate that a lot of the claims were fake. And I only did that because just rationally, whenever everybody does, when there's mass hysteria, I'm always like, wait a sec, there's mass hysteria about this. Let's look at the reality of the situation. And so then I just like did threads debunking, and then I ended up blowing up on Twitter. I think within a short period of time, I had like tens of thousands of followers.
Wow.
And then from that, I went onto the Twitter Spaces, which I debated the Andrew Tate situation. And again, because I was one of the only ones on that side, like obviously, and my position was quite strong. I ended up like obviously doing well on them debates and defeating the other side, and that just propelled me. So then from there, I blew up, got a significant amount of followers, and then a large part of the following obviously has been since October the 7th.
So we'll get into October 7th and all the, I guess, maybe more important conversations, but I want to start actually, how did you go from the law to philosophy to math? What's up with that? You're just trying to like conquer every single subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got this thing, like I love knowledge and information, and that's like the nerdy part of me, right? So I love researching and looking into information. So for me, it was always like, oh, that sounds interesting, let me do it. So I did law, and then I was like, that's maths. I've always loved maths, let me try maths. And then philosophy, and then not just philosophy, I've learned quite a bit of the Islamic science as well. And not just the standard ones as well, I've learned some of the niche ones, which obviously we won't get into in this podcast, but I've learned a wide range of things because I just love learning and reading. I've not had as much chance since Twitter in the last year to read as much, but before that, I was like a massive bookworm.
Okay, let's talk about Andrew Tate real quick, because I actually know very little about why his case is fraudulent, as you describe it. So what's up with that?
So, I mean, are you asking the reasoning or specifics about the case?
No, I can guess the reasoning for myself, but the specifics about the case, the debunking that you did.
Yeah. So the debunking was initially there was a lot of mainstream media articles, hit pieces against him, right? So I basically just analyzed them. Again, you know how we do now, analyzed the articles, looked at the flaws in them articles, and then basically did threads debunking them. So like, for example, when they were trying to claim that, you know, he'd basically done human trafficking, I was like, wait a sec, there's no evidence for this, especially at that point where there was hardly any evidence out there. Even now, there's a scarcity when it comes to evidence, but at that time, there's hardly anything. And so it was largely debunking mainstream media pieces, debunking a lot of the claims. And then what happened was, funny enough, I came to the United States and I end up investigating, and I end up finding, you know, the women who were basically making the claims against him. I end up researching and interviewing a lot of people in America who had basically made the claims against him or who were connected to the women. Funny enough, it was quite close to here, Fort Lauderdale or wherever it is, right? So I went there, I started interviewing, and that's when the case blew up, because I ended up finding out that like one of the women, she had a significant nefarious past. She had a history of making these allegations against men, and she had quite a distorted past in terms of some of these claims she made, and even like one of her ex had basically killed himself and so on and so forth.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so the past was significant. I blew that up through my investigation.
And you interviewed her?
I didn't interview her because obviously...
But you investigated
if I interviewed her, it would have been chaos. It would have been like, they already were trying to get me in trouble at that time just by interviewing people who knew her, but were basically telling me the truth about her. So I didn't interview her, nor did I even try and contact her or her family. But in terms of people who were a lot more vocal about wanting to speak to me, I spoke to a significant number of people, interviewed them, investigated. I was a bit careful in what I released at that point because I didn't want to damage the case as well. So I passed some of it on to his legal team, and some of it I did release.
Very interesting. And what motivated you to do that?
Well, it's just from a like my thing is this, like we've seen through recent times, whenever there's been an uproar about a certain situation, I always have significant question marks. So for example, Ukraine, Russia, COVID, and so when you have that, and then Andrew Tate became another situation like this. Now the Israel-Palestine is another situation like this. There's other questions I have as well. For example, I was speaking to Nick Fuentes yesterday, and I was like, there's a lot of drama about the border. Is there so much that now I'm starting to think that, is this a psyop? I know a lot of Americans don't want to hear that, and they're going to probably lose their minds as soon as I say that. But when I looked into it, and you look at the number of people who come in illegally, it seems like the numbers are very similar now as they were the last 40 years. So what's changed? Now both sides claim that the figures are fake. So they say that the ones who are like Republicans, they claim the Democrats are hiding the numbers because they want to hide the fact that so many illegal immigrants are coming in. And the other side are saying, no, these guys are just, well, they're not even talking about it that much, right? Obviously, that's because Zionists control both sides, so they want to make sure it's all murky. But coming back to the point, if we don't have the data and stats to prove it significantly, and then we're just relying on people relaying the story, then I want some kind of substantial evidence. And my thing is always, whenever the elite, Zionists, want the left or the right to fight, or more in this case, working class white Americans with minority working class people, they always want them to fight, because when they fight, they're not looking at those who are in power. So, and I think I'm starting to think, and this is not my position, it's just a question, it's right now the question I've been having very recently over the last few days, so it's just funny that I've come on your podcast. But it's a question I'm having, that, is it really true? So I'm always questioning things whenever there's a mainstream.
Yeah, generally skeptical, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's good. I think, oftentimes they just want us to believe whatever they're telling us, and I don't think we can do that. I feel the same as you. With Russia, Ukraine, for example, I didn't know as much as I needed to know. I just knew, I don't know if I want to trust CNN about this. I felt very skeptical, and so I started digging and digging and digging. And when you start from scratch, trying to find on Twitter or YouTube somebody that can give you an alternative perspective and they actually know what they're talking about, that takes a lot of time. I had to do a lot of research, and it took me several weeks until the algorithm, I think, understood who and what I was looking for. And then I started landing on Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, Judge Napolitano, and then I just started getting a completely different perspective about Russia, Ukraine. And that's when I started to realize, okay, mainstream media has been telling me a completely different story, and now I know enough to say with confidence they've been lying to me. So that's good. I think definitely being skeptical is a good idea. I want to comment a little bit on this immigration conversation. I'm curious to hear what Nick Fuentes thought. And I'd like to talk a little bit about him as well. The way I see immigration in this country, I think it's interesting because they need the immigration for cheap labor. If you live in this country and you go into a lot of these different stores, you'll find that a lot of these jobs that people don't want to work are being worked by immigrants right now. And corporations love that because they can, hire these hardworking people for very little. So they need the cheap labor, right, to keep the economy going and to keep their profits as high as they have them. But then at the same time, they don't take into consideration how allowing that many people into the country can drastically change the demographics. And as I understand it, the Democrats have been deliberately doing this, especially in states like Texas, because that's how they're going to flip the state and make it blue. If Texas goes blue, the Republicans will never win the presidency ever again. And so I don't know, that's just how I understand it. I could be wrong on that, but I'm curious to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, I've got a different perspective. I'll probably lose a lot of followers by saying this, but and because I've never really talked about the immigration issues, I'd say I'm quite distinct in the sense of I'm pro-immigration, right? And in the sense of, because I think that any society that is multicultural is a more successful society. So in my view, ethno-states have never been successful. So when in history has an ethno-state been successful? Or when right now is an ethno-national state successful? So let's look at our ethno-national states now. I talked about yesterday, like Japan, Korea, failed states. One could say that they failed because of lack of godliness, right? Or it's because it's an ethno-national state, right? So what's the reason why Britain and America are elite, in my view? The reason is because we have a majority white populace with a multicultural, a country with people from multicultural perspectives.
But elite in what way? What do you mean? Successful in what way?
Well, if you look at it, they've been when you look at it from a financial perspective, they've been dominating. When you look at it from a military perspective, they've been dominating. When you look at
so
it
I
from
was just going to say, I feel like to push back a little bit, I think the reason why they're successful is not necessarily because it's multicultural or ethno-nationalist state. I think they're successful because they've had the biggest, baddest militaries for the last few hundred years.
Well, even if you look at it from a innovation perspective, again, America is like elite in that regard, right?
Definitely.
And the reason for that is because of this kind of, because when you have a society where you're just going to specify to one race, you're not going to have that society be as elite or successful or progressive. So as an example, if you look at the empires of the past, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, it was always multiracial, multi-ethnic, and that's how they were successful. Ethno-states, I mean, you could say Germany, some would argue, was doing okay, but then they flopped. They got like.
Let me ask you this: do you feel they were successful because they were multicultural, or did they become multicultural because they were successful? Because what attracted my father, right, to the United States, and my father was one of the best and brightest of his class, like in Iraq. He was like top of his class. He got visa to go study at Oxford University in the UK, and then eventually he was able to come to the US and get his PhD. So he's one of the top, right? And many other people like him from his generation came here for the money, right? For what America has to offer. So do you think it's successful because of the multiculturalism, or the multiculturalism happens because the success attracts people from all around the world?
No, it's both. So basically, people want to come to these countries because of the success of those countries. But those countries are successful because of multiculturalism. So and America's always been a multicultural country, right? So America's like a good example. But like, for example, even UK has been doing extremely well because of its multiculturalism, right? After the World War, like the UK was completely destroyed. It'd been bombed significantly. And it was actually, for example, my grandparents are from Pakistan, right? And so those people who had been colonized had come from those colonies to help rebuild the country. So multiculturalism, in my view, is something that has been tried, has been tested, and has been successful. If you look at, for example, ethnostates, I always give Japan, Korea as an example, because first of all, you look at it, it's a failed, look at the birth rate, right? So the birth rate throughout the world is significantly bad. But Korea is like, even then, 3 times, 4 times worse than even Britain. So it means like it can't be because of modernity, because if it's because of modernity, you'd basically so modernity is causing Korean, Japanese women to like literally be even more averse to having sex or getting with guys. It's clearly not specifically because of modernity, right? There's going to be other factors that cause almost a 3-4 times significant drop in birth rate, and so this is a factor, as well as if you look up Japan, it's got many other problems, like suicide rate is really bad, but I think that's more linked to lack of godliness and so on and so forth. So ethnostates, when have they been successful? There's no successful ethnostate. And so for that reason, and this is funny enough when I was speaking to Fuentes, because you mentioned him, because I always thought his position was an ethnostate, a white Christian ethnostate, but that's not his position. His position is very similar to our position, which is a majority white, but a multicultural state where he won't be deported just because you're basically a minority. So that's literally the most, I would say, balanced, maybe even more towards the left position you can even have. That from an immigration perspective, I think that's important.
So Fuentes, tell me more about him. I've been looking into him. You know, obviously I've heard that he's been deplatformed. I've heard that they say he's an anti-Semitic ethno-nationalist. I've heard, these types of things. And I looked into him. I think some of his positions are quite sensible. I don't know that much about him, but I've seen his criticism of Zionism. And I know that he bumped heads with Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire a bit. So what do you know about him? What do you make of him?
Yeah, look, I've met him, right? He's a very nice guy, right? Very nice guy. And again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, so I can only talk about like some like conversations I've had with him. Questions I had myself. Like, obviously, if he's got some extreme positions, then I want to know what they are. It doesn't mean that I'm going to completely discard the person, because I'm cool with like people having a wide variety of positions. I'm completely for free speech, as opposed to a lot of these fake people who claim they were for free speech and now they are being exposed, which I know we're going to talk about in a bit. So with him, I actually thought, as you said, he was a white ethno-nationalist Christian, so he wanted just a white majority, right? I mean, not white majority, just white people, which we know like that would never work in America, right? If you look at America itself, the founding fathers, who were the founding fathers. They were a mix of like Christians, deists, Masons. So they had a wide mix of people who with different ideologies who were basically the founding fathers of America. So it wasn't even one religion, right? So coming back to him, he doesn't believe in this ethno-national state. I think he believes in, and I don't want to put words in his mouth from the conversation, in a white majority, but it is a multi-ethnic race and so that's his position in terms of immigration. The real reason he's been deplatformed is this, because when you hear that, you think that's not that bad. Now, he does believe, because we have the position that we believe like Zionists are controlling things, right? Zionists have a huge amount of impact because we know Christian Zionists are a lot more numerically bigger than Jewish Zionists, right? But his position obviously is that Jews run the world. And Jews are dominating, and Jews are the ones who are causing the problems. So whereas we believe that it's Zionism, which is an extreme element within Judaism, he believes this, and so that's where he differentiates. But why should someone who believes that be deplatformed? We have people who are platformed who make the very same argument about Islam, even though it's a flawed argument. And yet, not only are they platformed, for example, on Twitter, they boosted, right? So again, it shows this discrepancy. There is a protection of, for example, Zionism or even Judaism, which is not a balanced society, because what it should be is you have complete free speech.
So what do you make of the America First movement?
I respect it a lot. I respect Nick Fuentes' movement, because I would say that any movement that is putting its country first, I'm for it. Because if they're going to put their country first of all, they ain't going to be bombing brown people in the Middle East, right? And destroying them and destroying their lives and destroying their livelihood. That's the first thing. So I'm for it from a foreign policy perspective significantly. And that's how it makes it relevant to us, right?
So is America First isolationist then?
That's something you need to specifically ask Nick Fuentes in terms of how it is. But from my perspective, if I was running the America First movement, I would have it where you wouldn't be isolationist in terms of from a trade perspective, from a military perspective, but you wouldn't be, for example, partaking in wars, partaking in foreign, disrupting foreign nations. Because you can't be completely isolationist as well. That kind of society wouldn't be successful. But at the same time, what you've got right now, which is the complete opposite, which is meddling in the affairs, overthrowing governments, causing anarchy in nations, who then are problematic for future people as well, is something that is completely problematic.
I see. Yeah, I'm going to be paying more attention, right, to Fuentes. I think the America First movement is important, regardless of what it really means, because I know it means different things to different people. It's quite broad. But I like seeing the challenge that the America First crowd is giving to the conservatives, like from the Daily Wire, that maybe they're not Israel first, but they definitely have Israel right next to America.
I mean, I think they're Israel
they treat them
first.
as one and the same.
I mean, what we're seeing over the last few days and last weeks, I would say that these people have demonstrated that they're Israel first, because when you're willing to destroy the Constitution, destroy free speech for a foreign nation, it means you ain't putting your nation's interest first. Because your nation, if you look at America in itself, there's a reason the First Amendment was the First Amendment, right? The right to free speech. It's ironic. I was speaking to somebody just a week ago, right? And I was like, look, I don't mind moving to the United States because you guys have free speech. And then we saw the House pass the bill yesterday. So I think you guys are definitely America is moving towards a totalitarian fascist society, and the reason for that is, the root cause of that is because they're putting Israel first.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm somewhat in agreement. I think still waiting to see how it plays out. I like the challenge that they're putting forth, though, and so we'll just have to see how big this movement can grow. So you said this was Fuentes' movement. He's the one who started America First.
Yeah, from what I understand, the America First is Fuentes' thing, and then he's got the whole, he's got a massive, passionate following, right? And shout out to them. They always give me a huge amount of support on Twitter. But yeah, I mean, it is his movement. And what you're seeing is, when I look at Twitter right now, or social media, it's only his movement that's actually putting America first. Everyone else is now extremely pro-censorship, is extremely pro-putting Israel first ahead of American interests, and that's nothing more demonstrative than what's happening in the college campuses. It's literally exposing everybody. That's why I said, like, October the 7th has exposed everyone. It doesn't matter what ideology people claim they were. It doesn't matter what thought process people claim they were. As soon as that happened, the masks were off, and we saw the true faces of like what everyone's real positions are.
So I want to ask you, some more questions about Fuentes, America First. So Fuentes has been contributing, you could say, to the Palestinian movement through his criticism of the state of Israel and the influence of the Zionist lobby in the United States. At the same time, though, people would look at Fuentes, and say, maybe we shouldn't be getting too close to someone like Fuentes because we don't know actually if this person's anti-Semitic. I'm not saying that he is. I'm still learning about him. And I like a lot of his views, and I think he's a passionate speaker, and I'm fascinated by his story. Whenever someone that young can be that influential, they're very bright. And I think there's a lot to learn from them. At the same time, though, I wonder, is there merit to this concern that people have that, maybe, you can support Palestine, sure, but, maybe we shouldn't include you in the movement?
Yeah, look, I have been significantly against anyone who tries to specify who can be part of the movement and who can't. And this is a significant problem we've had with everybody. I've always held a position, and I've always had the same position throughout these last 7-8 months, is it doesn't matter what your position is, as long as you're highlighting the plight of the Palestinian people, as long as you're exposing the lies of the Zionist machine, then everyone should be part of the movement. You shouldn't specify the movement. Now, as an example, when you're trying to say people like Nick Fuentes shouldn't be part of the movement, what are you taking out of the movement? So you're taking people, probably the people who are having a significant influence on the right, to say that, look, don't be Israel first, and then they're exposing Zionist lies. If you look
so I wouldn't reject someone like Fuentes. I just mean, for example, you mentioned how a key aspect of Fuentes' criticism is that he drops the word Zionism and he says Jews have too much influence.
Yeah.
Well, for a long time, like I was an activist in college, BDS activist, part of Students for Justice in Palestine. We worked very hard to distinguish, right? We said our issue is not with the Jews. Our issue is with the Zionists. And as you mentioned, there are many Christian Zionists. So our issue is the political ideology and the way it manifests itself in the state of Israel and its policies of apartheid and occupation, and then of course the policies in the United States through their lobbying and changing, the Constitution just to protect Israel from criticism. So we've worked very hard to focus on the word Zionism because we needed to protect the movement from the very cheap slander that the Zionists attack you with, which is you're anti-Semitic. So we've worked very hard to not make this about Jews, to make it about Zionists. But then you have Fuentes and others who make it directly about the Jews. And I'm not saying there's anything, if they make a valid argument, their voices should be heard. They should not be deplatformed. But I do have to express on behalf of people who have brought forward this concern, is there a problem there?
Yeah, so look, coming back to the point, I get what you're saying, but the issue is within the movement, what is the movement, right? So I guess we've got to answer that question first, because is the movement, because remember, these people who said the movement, they want to remove people from the left. And now we see the vast majority of people who are, and we knew this anyway, for anyone who wasn't dumb, right? That the vast majority of people who are a part of the movement is from the left. And yet people from the right are like, oh, anyone from the left can't be part of the movement because they believe in LGBTQ, they're blue haired and all this kind of arguments to make, right? So let's go, so now you want to remove them from the movement, right? Because they don't have the same principles as you in terms of, and maybe it's from an Islamic perspective, or maybe it's from a, we want to keep the movement more centrist, or whatever it may be. You want to remove the them from it. And then the same people say, oh, guess what? The people from the movement, they have to be pro-axis of resistance, right? Or have to be pro-Iran. And then the thing is, wait a second, you want the movement to be just pro-Iran, but a significant portion of Sunnis are not pro-Iran because they do have sectarian issues, unfortunately, right? We don't agree with it, but they do. So it means you want to remove almost all Sunnis from the movement because they're not pro-Iran, right? Or from the other side, people are, I'm sure, for example, now people who were anti-Bashar, right? Or who are for the destruction of Syria, who are for the rebellion of Syria. Again, is largely Sunnis. You want to remove them. Now you're taking a large part of Sunnis from the equation. On the other hand, the same people, Salafists, want to take this in, or Shias, these guys are not the same as Zionists. We want to remove them from the movement. The movement is a Sunni movement. Hamas is Sunni, or for example, Palestinians are Sunni. Then they shouldn't be part of the movement. And so everyone's making this argument about everyone. So what is the movement, and who decides what the movement is?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and it's an important one. You're right. I think, and that's the problem is sometimes the Zionists it's very easy for them to just pick who's trying to represent the movement and the way they communicate about the movement. So it's very easy for them to kind of present the Palestine movement as this like hippie dippy liberal leftist woke bullshit with with all due respect. I love the people on the left who are supporting, but they take the most extreme version of that and they say, oh, look at this privileged college student, just a communist who's never worked a day in their life, and they want divestment from their university or whatever. And then on the flip side, they could take someone who's saying it's the Jews, it's not the Zionists, and say, oh, look, they're anti-Semitic. And so I agree with you. I think we have to make room for everyone, but I think we do need to center Palestinians, and we need to agree on like some type of base foundation. That's the difficulty, I know, and that's been the challenge for years, but we need to agree on like what is the best way to advocate for Palestinian rights.
So my position is this, right? We as individuals have our own positions, right? And we're very consistent in our positions. Like I said, we're against Zionism, we're against the Zionist control. Like if you look at even the governments, they're not Jewish people who are basically Zionists who are controlling things. Although Nick Fuentes' crew will argue that it's because of the Jewish influence on them, hence why it's happening, right? And so one can't dispel their arguments because whatever you look at it, even my position is this. So I think Zionism is an extreme form of Judaism, right? And Zionism is highly problematic. So just like ISIS have Muslims, so just like Muslims have ISIS and their extreme version, Zionism is that to Judaism. But the problem we have is, and something we have to acknowledge is, that with ISIS, when you've got 2 billion Muslims, is an extreme minority. But when you look at the Zionist movement from a proportional perspective, it's proportionally a lot higher. And hence why people like Fuentes' argument then start holding a lot more merit. And let me be clear, like people in Fuentes' crew get upset with me when I make that distinction, or for example, and I make that distinction and say it, and they're like, why, it's even, for example, the issue that it was in Emory University with Norman Finkelstein, they give that as an example and say, look, they don't want, he's a Jewish guy, he claims he's from the pro-Palestinian position, but he didn't really want to speak about what happened on October the 7th because they want to control the narrative in the way they want. I disagree with that, but I'm just giving you their perspective.
Right, it's something they would say, right?
Yeah, it's something they would say. So coming back to it, should someone like Fuentes' crew be part of the movement? I say 100% yeah. Because even though we disagree with the parameters, you look at the impact they've had much more impact than most people. A lot of the debunkings that we did on social media, they were part of the debunkings.
They were, definitely, they were. So I don't know everyone who's part of the crew, but there's this guy, Sam Parker.
Yeah, he's
great. He's great. He's been very supportive, and he's also contributed to a lot of the debunkings.
Sam Parker, Chief Trumpster, Lucas Gage, Jake Shields. These guys have...
Lucas Gage, bro.
With Lucas, I respect him a lot, right? Because I interviewed him. If you look at his background, right? Yeah. He's got a military background.
I'm familiar with his background. He's a very interesting guy. He has an inspirational story.
He does, yeah.
And I admire and I respect the fact that he was able to, to reflect on his actions and wake up and say, I was used and abused essentially to use and abuse other people on the behalf of the interests of, these corrupt elite. I heard him for the first time. I never knew who he was. I was in your space. Do you remember one? You're not going to remember, of course. You do spaces all the time, but it was quite early on. And, the IDF Unit 8200, they'd have these fake Zionists that they're real Zionists, but they would come in and they would pretend to be like well-meaning Israelis that they just want to talk. And she kept going on and on about wanting to have coffee with the Arab neighbor. And this was going on. And I remember I interrupted and I said, let's move on. She's hijacking the space. Yeah. And I remember you were well-meaning. You were like, no, let's give her I want to hear her out. Let's see. But then Lucas Gage blew a lid and he was like, shut the fuck up. I don't want to hear your bullshit during a genocide. And you're talking about having coffee with Arabs in Israel. Like, this is an apartheid state. Fuck you and your feelings. And I loved it. I loved it. But then I saw, he got canceled.
No, but what he got canceled for was manipulated, right? So if you look at that video...
He was speaking metaphorically.
He was speaking metaphorically, but it was actually snipped out of context. So like, imagine taking this 2-hour podcast and they cut up certain bits and then make it look like I'm anti-Semitic or make it look like you're anti-Semitic. So that's literally what happened.
Yeah. But he does post videos all the time of Adolf Hitler. And it makes it very... I appreciate history.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid to listen to what Adolf Hitler had to say.
Yeah.
but
So look,
makes you feel uneasy a little bit. And I guess that's the point, right?
No, but that's what he does. He tries to make people feel uneasy. So look, like for example, now I hold the position that Jewish people are oppressed, right? Throughout history, including the Holocaust, right? And I believe in the Holocaust. And I think anyone who speaks about the numbers is kind of diminishing the pain and suffering that they went through. So if it's 6 million, or if it's 5.2 million according to Norman Finkelstein, or it's 3 million according to some academics, whatever the number is, a lot of people suffered, right? That's one perspective, right? Now their perspective, and this is why I'm open to free speech. Hitler was, I know people won't want to hear this, Hitler was a Catholic, right? So Catholics and Jewish people have had beef for a very long time. Throughout,
I thought he was atheist. I didn't know he was Catholic.
No, he was a Catholic. Well, this is why this kind of, within certain movements, there is this kind of thing with Hitler, right? Because he was a Catholic, right? And so, I'm gonna think I might get in trouble for talking about this, but anyway. And so for that reason, people think that he was on, those people sometimes think he's on the right side because of that kind of affiliation. So they think that, look, it was the Jews who were causing a problem in Nazi Germany, and Hitler, being a Catholic, was dealing with the same problem that Catholics have dealt with Jews for thousands of years or whatever. So that's their perspective. So they don't demonize Hitler completely for that reason. By the way, I'm not saying Lucas Gage has that position or anyone else. I'm just trying to give a holistic perspective.
Yeah,
I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. My own what I'm seeing myself from my own readings of history and my own understanding of what it is. And so for that reason, you kind of had that kind of dichotomy in differences in what's happening. So my position is this, like coming back to it, I do think Jewish people were oppressed for a significant period of time. I think what happened in the Holocaust was horrific. And then I think what happened was the Zionist movement that kind of got created after that, which was there to, and after that, basically what happened was, in my view.
Well, the Zionist movement predates the
Holocaust. It predates it. So look, it predates it in the sense of because they wanted to have a state, right? And my own position is this ideology of Zionism has always been there, even for a very long time. So as an example, like for example, if you look at Christianity, if you look at Islam, I think there were certain movements that were pushed in by people who had this ideology. And I don't mean Jews, because people will be like, well, there was no Zionism, so he means Jews. But what I mean is people who had this kind of ideology of impacting certain ideologies or controlling certain ideologies in a way. So I think that happened to certain sects within Islam. And I believe it happened to a significant sect within Christianity. And so for that reason, when it comes down to it, there was this impact. So then, yeah, they wanted a state in whatever it was. But then what happened after the Holocaust was, there was this idea that, look, it's not just about state, but we need to basically put ourselves in a position where the two biggest threats to us never be threats to us again. So the two biggest threats were Muslims and white Christians. And I believe that they dealt with it in the sense of destroying Muslim countries because they would never give up their religion, their ideals, and infiltrating white Christian countries and taking control of them.
Interesting. I think it's interesting that they viewed Muslims as being a great threat to them, because historically, while obviously Muslims probably weren't great to the Jews all the time, for the most part, you know, they were very, very good to them. I think they had
100% they were.
Like Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, for example, who liberated Jerusalem from the Crusaders. His one of his lead doctors and advisors was Maimonides, yeah. Yeah, Maimonides.
Who was a brilliant philosopher as well.
Yeah, a Jewish philosopher, and he came from Spain, I believe.
Yeah. I can't remember his origins, but what I do know is Maimonides, he's like literally very smart, and he was a philosopher. I've read his books, and his philosophy is on point, right? Yeah. But coming back to it, yeah, of course there was, and even at that time, like obviously, again, both perspectives. I mean, when you look at it from their perspective, they think the Jews were, again, causing problems. But if you look at it from, again, it was the Muslims who were supporting them in the Crusades when they were actually being eradicated. For sure, 100%. That's like been the history. There's always been beef between the Catholics and the Jews for 100%. And generally speaking, the Muslims have been supporting the Jewish people. This, again, shows the greatest irony of what's happened, that when and again, this is not Jews, because, again, I'm trying to say, but from that movement came the Zionists. From that movement, from Judaism, when the Zionists came, when they've started controlling things, the people they've oppressed as Muslims, which is kind of sad to see.
So I'd like to transition now to talking directly about October 7th.
Yeah.
So October 7th, we're 7 months in now, about 35,000 people killed, perhaps more. The numbers are.
Yeah, I don't believe the Hamas numbers. I'm with the Zionists. I think I think the numbers are much higher.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised if it's 100,000.
Are you being serious or are you sarcastic right now?
No, I'm being serious. I'm being sarcastic in the sense of I say I agree with them that I don't believe the Hamas numbers.
Yeah, no, I got that. But 100,000, you're serious.
Yeah, I think this is easily 100,000.
Dead, not
dead.
maimed or injured.
Yeah. Like, if you look at it from just like a logical perspective, such a saturated area, the way they've been bombing, the way they've been destroying places, the way they've been killing, it's been indiscriminate. Remember the number's been like 30, 40,000 for like months and months and months.
Yeah, it has. And that's what's been confusing to me.
Yeah.
I think, too many people are dying. To me, it doesn't really matter what the numbers are. I don't know why people need to feel bad. 100,000 sounds worse than 30. So let's say that. It doesn't matter. Like, too many people are dying.
I agree, 100%.
And the Israelis they're so sick on X when they mock the numbers and they say like there is no genocide, there is no starvation, as if we're not seeing them drop bombs on one of the most highly densely populated areas on Earth. Like, what do you expect dropping a 2,000-pound bomb into a densely populated neighborhood? Of course people are going to die. Of course it's going to be in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. But they just gaslight and manipulate. It's sick. But I want to ask you about October 7th, the fallout, so where we are right now. How have you interpreted it 7 months in terms of its impact on the world?
So its impact on the world, in my opinion, it's over for Israel, right? They've been exposed so badly in real time. It's been unbelievable. So like I said, the masks were off, right? So now what's happened is the West always positioned itself as a framework that basically polices the world from a humanitarian perspective, from a morality perspective. And what's happened is this complicity has basically exposed them. So the next time, let's say now China decides to invade Taiwan, they can't be like, oh, morally this is wrong, you're a strong going against the weak, because we've literally seen them support and be complicit in a genocide. And the fact that they've been flagrant about it, the fact that they've vetoed, it literally has exposed them. Furthermore, when you look at Israel, their actions, they've been, from just a moral perspective, been demonstrated as the most evil entity that there is. Because if you look at, let's say you believed their narrative on October the 7th, which we know is being significantly debunked, right? But let's say you believe their narrative, right? And 1,000 people had been killed. Even they say it's about 600 civilians or whatever, right? So for 500-600 civilians being killed to have this level of response, any normal person would be like, this is abnormal behavior. It's akin to somebody coming to you, giving you a slap on the face, and then you responding by killing him, killing his whole family, killing everyone who ever met him. And so when you look at an average person, they know that these actions are just crazy. But what they've done is almost created a new standard. And the new standard is basically the rules don't apply to anyone. And that's what's happened in terms of exposing from that perspective. Then overall, from an overall perspective, is the fact that we're able to have this conversation, right? The fact that everyone's talking about Zionism, the fact that everyone understands the level of power they've got, the fact that basically everyone's able to speak about the level of control they've got on foreign governments. That wasn't possible before October the 7th, right? And yet now it's possible. But so there's been, the window has shifted in terms of what you're able to talk about and how you're able to talk about it. So that's had a huge impact. And I do believe in the West, people are waking up as well. So if you look at the United Kingdom, we've had protests of millions of people. Remember, in the United Kingdom, we have 40 million adults. If you look at people who are going to possibly be able to partake because they're old enough, it's probably about 30 million people. And yet on one weekend, we had almost like 1.3 million people. So that's people who physically went to London and decided they want to protest. Never mind the fact that people who are vocally for Palestine but didn't decide to go to London. So it's literally over for them from all perspectives, in my view.
Yeah, I think in terms of PR, they've destroyed their reputation, and it's irreparable, I think. Yeah. And the reason why I like seeing what's happening with the America First movement is because for the last 15 years, we've seen in America that it's usually the left, and when I say the left, I mean the liberal democratic left. I don't mean communist Marxist. They've always been supportive of Palestine. Israel never had their support. They never supported Israel. But with the attacks on Gaza in 2012, 14, they started losing more and more of the Democrats and the liberals. But I think what we're seeing now, a decade later, in 2024, with this genocide, you're seeing them lose the right, important segments of the right. And that is, I think, because of America First in a lot of ways, because of Fuentes and these guys criticizing Israel and exposing them. And what's also important, I think, is creating this rift. I love when they say, are you Israel first or America first? Because we've never seen that before. We've never heard that kind of conversation. That's new. And so for me, 10 years ago, the Israelis understood that they lost a significant portion of the Democrats and they were never going to get them back. And so they felt comfortable with, at least we still have the right. Well, now they're starting to lose the right. And I think that, to me, is one of the most significant forms of progress, I should say, for the pro-Palestine movement in America. And so I think that's a plus. And
and a good example of that was, for example, Candace Owens, right? She was almost the epitome of that, because Candace Owens, someone that I mean, she said it herself as well, but I always believed it. Like, I thought she doesn't like Muslims. She's kind of like got positions that are highly problematic for us from an Islamophobia perspective. And then she's full on the Daily Wire, which I always call them out. It wasn't an October 7th thing for me. Now, coming back to it, and then her literally leaving that and realizing that, wait a sec, what's going on? You know, you're not allowed to say Christ is king. Now they're going to basically make it so that even certain aspects of the Bible are criminalized. So I think these people 100% are waking up, and it is from the right. I think there was the Hodgkinson's twins as well. There's a significant portion of people who are not even part of the America First movement, but are like, what's going on here? So I agree with you.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't like being told what they can or cannot say. And it's the more people enter the conversation about Israel-Palestine and they just express their opinion and then they're shot down and say, you can't say that, or that's anti-Semitic, I think that just galvanizes people and makes them see Israel and Zionism for, you know, more and more for what it is. So I think that's a good thing. I want to ask you about the resistance, Palestinian resistance. So they decided to commit this attack on October 7th. Their objective was to attack Israeli military bases, to take hostages, whether they were civilians or military, bring them back to Gaza, and then use them to negotiate for their rights and for their interests, because the Israelis had completely refused to acknowledge them as a party negotiating. They refused, they ignored them. Netanyahu's at the UN, he's holding this sign, and it's the map of Palestine, and Gaza and the West Bank are completely erased, and it's just all Israel. And he has boasted very proudly that he's the reason why there's no Palestinian state and there will never be a Palestinian state. And so they felt compelled to do this, and so they do it. 7 months later, seeing what you've seen, was it worth it?
So when you look at it from, first of all, I don't think that their objective was to get civilians. I think it was purely a military objective to get military personnel. I think what happened was, because of the disarray that occurred, because of, as you know, like, for example, the Apache helicopters, the short artillery fire in the kibbutzes, there was a panic, and they end up taking more people who end up being civilians, and that was never the plan. Hence why they had to way too many hostages than they actually wanted. That was never the plan. Remember, in the past when they did exchanges, it was like 1 to 1,000 or something. So the plan was always military personnel. In terms of whether it was worth it, so obviously the loss of life is never worth it, and that was never their plan, right? Their plan was literally, let me take some military personnel, X number, is probably in the 20, 30, 40, and we will exchange them for 4,000 of our women and children mainly, who are being held in Israeli prisons as hostages. So that was always the plan. So when you say it's worth it, it wasn't worth it because that was never the plan. That was never their plan, and that was never anybody's plan. What has happened consequentially is that, no, it wasn't, in terms of what's happened, no, there's been way too much loss of life. What's happening to the Palestinians, you can't see an end in sight. And in that regard, like, I do believe that we've had a huge problem where there's not been enough support for the Palestinian cause from countries around, both from a physical military perspective and from a financial support perspective. And that is both Sunni and Shia countries, right? Because I know that Iran has supported. So obviously they've supported the resistance, Hezbollah supported, and they've done it as the best they can without allowing the World War III to happen. But the issue is that, could they have done more in the sense of going into it from a military perspective? Some would argue yes, but then the risk is World War III. So I guess these are things we could talk about. The Sunni countries themselves, like, they've just been completely exposed in terms of them not supporting. It's been embarrassing. Yeah. And by the way, I'm a Sunni, so it's not like I'm trying to...
No, I hear you. Yeah. I think most people would agree. Well, maybe asking was it worth it is not the right way to think about it. But recently I gave this speech at Emory University, and one bit that several people, even people close to me, told me that they took issue with was my description. This is how I described October 7th. It was desperate, it was destructive, but it was necessary. And what I meant by that was, providing the context I provided for you earlier, I'm not saying it's morally right or wrong. We're not even talking about that. The point is that the Palestinians have been completely cut out of negotiations. And what is war? Is another form of negotiating. If you don't want to treat us as equals, if you don't want to engage in diplomatic discussions, then you leave us no other option. We need to get your attention somehow. And the Palestinians have stated themselves that the world had completely abandoned them. So in terms of getting the world's attention, they've achieved that. And I think, so I'm not trying to say it's worth it, of course. And
No, what you're trying to say is this, right? So let's say hypothetically, October the 7th was what they claim it was, right? Which it wasn't, obviously we know it's all fake, right? But let's say it was what they claim it was, right? Then the question becomes that as Palestinians, did they have a right to make that move? And then the question becomes this, and it is actually kind of like a morality question, that if a person has been abused, has been oppressed, has been put in a calorie diet, do they have the right to speak up against or resist against the person who put that person in that condition? It's akin to this. I have a slave, I tie him up, I throw him a few breadcrumbs every day, I abuse him, I beat him, right? Somehow he breaks out the shackles. He sees me. What will he do to me? Would he do everything in his power, even be violent, to get out of my basement or where I've locked him up in a cellar? Or would he be like, thank you, sir, and try and sneak out, and but then I've got like maybe 5-10 people there? What would a slave do in that scenario? He would resist. He would physically hurt me to try and get himself out of that situation, right? And so everybody knows from a moral perspective, that's what would happen. So now, imposing that onto what happened now, would somebody who's in that position act in this manner? And that's the question we're asking. We can't understand that because we live in a very privileged situation. We live in the West. Our mind, our psychology is not made up that way. Our mind isn't made up of a person who's been living in solitary confinement for decades, or somebody who's literally has to count the calories, someone who's not allowed to have a chocolate, someone who's literally been living in that regard. So our mind doesn't think like that, right? But imagine a person's mind who had to live in that scenario. What would he do in that scenario? So if you're able to answer that question, honestly, from a morally perspective and from a philosophical perspective, you'll have the answer of whether the moves that they made, that was it something that somebody would normally make in that condition.
Can you juxtapose the perspective of the Palestinians to resist what the Israelis have done to them and the way that the West has condemned it and responded to it, to Ukraine and Russia and what's happening there?
Well, Ukraine and Russia, I think, is not related in the sense of when you look at it from the same perspective. The Ukrainians were not oppressed, right? The Ukrainians weren't put in a prison, right? There was basically an open-air prison or a camp, right? So that never happened to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians actually, what they were doing was they were allowing NATO to meddle in their affairs. They were allowing military weapons into NATO, and Putin was almost backed in a corner to make a move. It's completely different, but maybe you mean by the outrage. So when you look at the outrage...
Well, what I mean is, like, to your point,
Yeah.
because you're right, and I agree with you there, but then they'll support Ukraine's right to resist Russia.
Exactly.
But not with the Palestinians who are experiencing far worse.
And it shows the hypocrisy, and I would say it's not even the same, because when we've framed the argument about the resistance of the Palestinians, it makes sense from a social philosophical perspective, right? Or morality perspective. But when you look at the Ukrainians, what were they resisting? They were resisting the fact that they're able to have Russia's enemy support them and control their government.
Yeah, they weren't really resisting, they were insisting.
Yeah, they weren't resisting. So if anything, if one would frame it, it would say Russia was resisting the kind of control that America wanted to have on its borders, or the NATO wanted to have. So that would be the thing. But I guess what you're maybe saying is the outrage that we saw in the West about Ukraine is a prime example of the hypocrisy, because they were outraged about what happened in Ukraine, but yet the same level of outrage has not happened when it comes to Palestine. Not people, because we've seen the people are with Palestine. There's a reason we've blown up. There's a reason our accounts are doing well, is because The world is with Palestine. But in terms of the people in power, obviously, it shows their hypocrisy for sure.
Absolutely. And very well said, by the way. I want to ask you, you were on the James Whale show?
Yeah.
I was watching that clip earlier, and that was infuriating, man, because this guy kept obstructing you, arguing with you, and then he would change the question. So you wouldn't even get a chance to like properly sit down and answer the question and explain and give his audience a chance to actually understand what you're saying and potentially change their mind. It's like he deliberately didn't want you to. So what was that experience like for you?
So with the James Whale show, right, I agreed to it first. And then I was sent clips about it. And the clips were crazy, right? Because he literally would not let someone speak at all, right? And he chucked so many people out of the studio. So I knew what I was getting myself into, right? So my tactic when I went in was to like blast information as fast as possible. So that was what I tried to do. I knew what they were going to try and do, and it wasn't perfect, obviously. It could have been much improved. But in terms of getting that information out quick as possible.
Yeah. I don't know how it could have been improved.
Yeah.
It's not designed for it to be
it's not.
better.
It is. So for me, it was like trying to get that information out as soon as possible. So if you look at their counters, they didn't really have any counters to the point. So if someone's smart enough, they could figure it out. But I agree, it's not set up in that way because they don't want people like us to be able. And this is the real issue, right? So there's a reason why, for example, someone like James Whale will have someone like me on there because, as you said, they can control it in a way that you're not able to give your opinion in a kind of broader perspective. But someone like Piers Morgan won't, right? Because with Piers Morgan, he knows that we'll be able to expose a lot of the propaganda in a very succinct, detailed way, right? And they don't want that. And so a prime example of that is Piers Morgan will have people who I call the Dawa Bros, who have almost been placed as representatives of Muslims, but in my view, they should never be representative of Muslims because a lot of their positions are the positions of the Zionists. So either, for me, they are not very smart or they serve the Zionist agenda.
When you say the Da'wah Bros, do you mean these Madkhalis that
not just the
was talking about?
Not just the Madkhalis, right? I'm talking about this entire, like, I don't want to call sex out because I'm not a sectarian, right? But like, for example, if you look at the people who kind of represent us, they're from a certain kind of ideological framework, right? And those people are not representative of most Muslims.
What are some examples of their views being Zionist views?
I think the major one's Syria, right? In my view, right? So if you look at, and there's many, I'll give you a few actually, because I don't want to make about this, because I know most people disagree with me on Syria, right? So Syria, in my view, was run by Bashar. Bashar's father was an Alawite, right? Shia. And Bashar himself, what sect is he?
He's an Alawite, isn't he not?
People claim that, but we don't know, right? Because I looked into this in detail. His teachers are actually Sunni. So for example, his teacher is Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti, is one of many of his teachers, and actually many of his teachers are Sunni. Even at that time, I said, give me proof that he's Shia, no one can prove it, right? So we don't know what Bashar is.
Is it possible he has these Sunni teachers as a kind of like tribal alliance type of deal where I'll show that I'm not just an Alawite serving the Alawites, that I'm...
It could be strategic, but then when I look at his... so I even showed a video, you know, when he prays Salah, he prays Hanafi style. And according to Alawites, that's not permissible. So even his legal method of praying is the Hanafi position. And actually, it's considered, according to some Alawites, heretical. I'm not trying to use like English terminology, heretical or even disbelief, right? And yet he's praying the Hanafi way. So he's learnt Sunni legal fiqh, and then he's learned Sunni theology, right? But again, I'm not saying he's Shia or Sunni. I'm just saying there's no evidence either way, right? So it could be tactical, or it could be that he's a Sunni. We don't know, right? But what I do know is Syria, Damascus, was the land of Sunni Islam. So if you look at many of the scholars who went to study, they would go to Syria to study, the Sunni scholars, and then they came to the West and became the Sunni scholars. So his country, despite being a Shia country, was where Sunnis used to study. That's the first thing. Now, when you look at Bashar himself, in my opinion, he did support the Palestinian cause, right? And he did even give citizenship to a number of Palestinians, right? And it was in the Zionist agenda to destroy that country. And in my view, what happened in Syria was, I think he ran that country as best he could, based on all of these dynamics. And then what happened was you had a certain elite people who wanted him out. And so they did this kind of protest against him. The children were basically graffitiing and causing, a bit of anarchy. Some would argue that maybe he was too soft on the protesters very early on. And that's what many people say about him, that he was too soft. And that allowed it to perpetuate into something larger. And then the West got involved, the Western media, some of the scholars got involved, and then they kind of perpetuated the rebellion in his country. I wrote significantly about this at that time, that from a Sunni perspective, from a Islamic fiqh perspective, Islamic aqidah perspective, theology, and from a legal perspective within Islam, it's actually not permissible to rebel against a ruler, right? It's actually considered either disbelief or it's considered heretical, right? So they ignored all the religious texts and rebelled against the leader. And also on top of that, from a geopolitical perspective, destroying that country was specifically for the Zionist agenda, because now it would probably be Bashar al-Assad who was lending significant support to the Palestinians if his country hadn't been destroyed, but there's nothing he can do. So I'm vehemently against these guys. And these guys were supporting the rebellion, the rebels, who later end up being ISIS, supporting that destruction that happened. And that's one example. Another example is when you look at, for example, right now, everybody is exposing Zionists, right? Everybody is exposing them. And yet in Germany, we had a march, right? I don't know if you saw it, but people are doing drama about it on social media by these ISIS HT type people, right? They say they claim to hate, they're linked to HT. And they were literally like, we want Sharia in Germany. What does that do? And then all the right-wing accounts, or all the Zionist accounts posted it, propelled it, even Elon Musk did, right? Because this serves the Zionist agenda, because then it makes it look like Muslims want to take over America, Muslims want to take over Europe, which is far from the truth. So why would you do such a march when at that specific time Zionists have been exposed and the control of the United States government and the UK government is being exposed in real time? So either they're not smart or they're serving the Zionist agenda. That's another example. Another example is the fact that they've been attacking, in my view, Iran significantly in a time when Iran is supporting the Palestinians, again causing this kind of sectarian divide. So these are just some of the examples, in my view, that are demonstrative of how they either negatively impact the movement or cause the Zionist agenda. Another example is in the UK, when they wanted to teach LGBTQ into schools, right? The people who they sent to represent Muslims did such a bad job that the people in the United Kingdom thought, oh, it's these barbaric people who don't want the children to learn about the LGBTQ in schools. Rather than explain it from a political perspective, explain the how it's a problem from the development of a child, how the brain hasn't developed, and so on and so forth. So for me, these people cause more harm than they do good. Now the question becomes, why are they causing the harm? Is it because they're just so entrenched in their sectarianism that they don't realize the harm they're causing, or is it because they're part of the Zionist agenda? Because ISIS was part of the Zionist agenda. So these are like questions that one has, and this is the problem that they're causing.
I see, interesting. So we'll talk about Syria briefly.
Yeah.
I know that there are certain segments of my audience that would like me to push back. I have to apologize to them because this is not my strong suit.
Yeah.
So I can't, and I don't take a very strong or passionate position on this, but I will push back to the best of my abilities on their behalf. They would say, I think, that Bashar al-Assad was an authoritarian dictator. Yes, Syria wasn't the greatest situation, but he did gobble up much of what was available in terms of the country's wealth for himself and for those around him. And he's the son of a dictator who did even worse. And there's the massacre in Hama, I believe. And so their beef, I think, is they would argue that this is not just an elitist plot to remove him as you described it. Certainly that's possible, but it did have broad support from many Syrians. I don't know about Syrians within the country itself, but I know that most of the Syrians I know in America were 100% against Bashar al-Assad, and they, if it were up to them, he wouldn't be in power. And they would, I think, laugh, honestly, if they heard someone say that Bashar al-Assad was an opponent to the Zionists. I know we hear this a lot from Hinkle and others. I haven't seen any evidence either way. I don't know that he's actually against the Israelis. I think just by his existence as a pathway for Iran to provide weapons to Hezbollah, then yeah, in that way he is, I guess, unintentionally standing against Zionists and the state of Israel. But I know that they've taken issue with that claim that Bashar al-Assad resists Israel and that he supports Palestine. They think that Bashar al-Assad, negotiated with Israel, essentially basically giving them the Golan Heights. So I guess what kind of evidence can you point to maybe that would just prove that he is, I guess, supportive of the Palestinian cause?
Yeah, of course. So look, and I understand look, I am a Sunni, right? So, and I understand there's a significant proportion of Sunnis who were for the removal of Bashar, right? And in terms of Syrians, we do have a mix. We have people who are anti-Bashar and we have people who are pro-Bashar, right? So that happened for sure. When you look at, for example, Bashar al-Assad and what he did, and by the way, my position has got not related to Jackson Hinkle. I actually initially came onto this issue from a religious perspective. So if you look at my articles early on, they were actually from narrating hadith and showing why it's not permissible, narrating books of theology, both from the Maturidi Ashari school as well as the Hanbali school. So I came at it completely from a theological, philosophical perspective, legal perspective, right? And then later, in addition to, not later, but it's not something I wrote about, but I was aware of the geopolitical perspective. Now coming back to, and so I'm very clear that I believe this is not allowed in Sunni theology. So they did it, and then retrospectively tried to claim that Bashar basically committed kufr, disbelief. But then they can't provide any evidence of him specifically doing it.
When you say rebellion is not permissible,
yeah,
do you mean armed rebellion?
So,
what is permissible? How can one criticize a leader?
So you can criticize a leader, but you can't overthrow a leader. And so criticism is fine. You can disagree with the leader as long as you're not causing anarchy in the country. This is kind of the Sunni position.
Can you peacefully protest and have mass civil unrest, let's say like they did in Egypt, which for the most part was peaceful when they overthrew Hosni Mubarak? Is that permissible?
So within the Sunni, they say that actually, according to, for example, one hadith, they say even if your leader is oppressive, then it's better for you to bite the branch of a tree than basically cause anarchy in the country. The reasoning for that is this, and you may disagree with it. By the way, this is the Sunni position. The Mu'tazili position is actually they're considered heretics, right? But the Mu'tazili position is you can't rebel against the leader. But coming back to it, so you in terms of the reason for it is because the position is, and we've kind of seen it, that what ends up happening is it causes more harm than good. So as an example, you look at Syria, the people who've been killed, the people who've died, the people who've been displaced. Syria is 1,000,000 times in a much worse position now, according to everyone, than it was before the rebellion against Bashar. So we call it rebellion because it's the terminology that's used within the Islamic texts. Now, the only time people claim that you can rebel, like from a physical perspective and cause anarchy in the country,
is if the leader has committed kufr.
Is committed kufr. Now you need to provide evidence that that leader has committed specific. So for example, in the Maturidi school, which is the, basically most Hanafis follow the Maturidi school, right? So, and he's the founder of Sunni theology. According to them, they say that, when someone makes a statement, even then they've not, and it sounds like kufr, it's not kufr. You need to ask him. You need to make 1,000 excuses for him to say, look, if I say, look, I'm God, sounds like kufr. But then I could be like, no, you could be like making an excuse for me. He means it metaphorically. He means he's the control of the studio. He's control of this podcast. And then a Muslim judge would come to me and say, what do you mean by that? Do you literally mean you're the Lord of the world, the Lord of the universe? And if I'm like, yeah, then that would be kufr. But if I'm like, no, I didn't mean it like that.
So not to discount this, I think this is important, the religious aspect of whether or not one can or should rebel against a leader. But I think really what common people, most people care about most is whether or not the leader has done a good job. And I think in Bashar's case, here's where I disagree with Hinkle. I tell him, look, if you want to say that the Syria revolution turned into a proxy that was exploited by the Gulf, who provided money and weapons, which one could argue they did in order to prevent the Arab Spring uprisings from arriving to their homeland, say, hey, you want to protest for democracy? Look what happens when you do that. Yeah. There'll be a civil war and it'll destroy everything. Are you sure that's what you want? I think so. if you want to say that it was exploited by the Gulf countries, by the CIA, and that they wanted to, remove Russian and Iranian influence in Syria, fine. But I think going as far to describe him as a hero who did the best he could for his country, I don't agree with that. I think there's little evidence for that.
I don't describe anyone as a hero, right?
I know, I'm talking about Hinkle, but your perspective, I think, was that he did the best he could for the country.
I think he did the best under the circumstances, based on the demographics he had, based on his geopolitical location. I think he did the best he could. What decisions would, because remember, you mentioned about his father. Look, the sins of the father can never be applied to the children, right? First thing. And the second thing is it even, so the other perspective on that is, and by the way, this is not my position, I'm just giving the other perspective. The other perspective is that when he did that massacre, that was to ensure that there, again, wasn't a rebellion that could cause the destruction of the country. And so then from a morality, philosophical perspective, like having a small massacre to ensure that million bigger one is. So that's the other perspective on that. But that's not my position.
That's the kind of moral and philosophical question I think most people don't want to consider.
Yeah, but in terms of Bashar himself, when I look at it and I think, so what I would have done different to Bashar was when them kids were rebelling, and doing them protests of them rich elite, I would have shot it down quicker.
You would have killed them.
No, I would have shot it down. not shot them down.
Hey, a small massacre to prevent a larger one.
No,
right?
so I would have not shot them down, but I would have stopped it quicker.
But they did arrest them and torture them to death, supposedly.
Allegedly, he did that, right? But in terms of he allowed the protest to continue for days and for a period of time. So some argue that he was a bit. Well, I think.
Well, hindsight is 20/20. I think all the leaders had a challenge where they're like, should we give the people a little room to breathe, let them demonstrate a bit, or should we crack down hard from the beginning? Every country handled it differently. Like in Tunis, they collapsed. Egypt collapsed. Libya turned into a proxy in a civil war, and Algeria actually had massive protests. Morocco as well, but they somehow managed to put them down. And they did so in their own way.
Yeah, but the difference is when it came to Syria, there was a significant interest to ensure that country did end up being destroyed.
Yeah, it was one of 5 or 6 countries, I think, mentioned in the Pentagon. There's this famous
exactly. And if you look at, because I know you mentioned, I think you kind of framed it from the other side, that maybe it was something that was organic and then people appropriated it. No, these guys were involved in it from day zero. I know myself that Turkey were basically encouraging this kind of propaganda to occur to cause the rebellion.
But did it really cause it? Because remember, you had the Arab Spring. You have to keep in mind 2 very important things, I think. One, there was this issue with Russian and Ukrainian wheat. There was some type of, I think it was a bad crop year. So the point is, you had lower supply, greater demand. So this shot food prices up in a region where wheat is very important, right? This is like a major portion of the Egyptian diet, for example. And the majority of the Middle Eastern people are poor, while their leaders are billionaires with lavish lifestyles and they have money overseas, and their children live like gods. And meanwhile, the majority of the people live in squalor. And this is true, it was true not just in Syria, but all over the region. And then you have this greater force of the rising cost of food, place a lot of pressure. And then this pressure made its way all the way to Tunis, where you have this young, educated college graduate who has to resort to selling produce on the street. And then one day he's abused by the police who tell him, you can't sell here. And that's his only way of living. And for many other reasons, he was stressed and depressed. And he set himself on fire. He committed suicide. And he burnt himself alive. And when he did that, that literally set fire to the entire region. So I think there were organic elements. And I can tell you, as a young Muslim myself living in America, I was very supportive of the uprisings in Egypt, and because of the perception that we had, because I've actually visited the Middle East. I've been to Iraq, I've been to these other places. I'm it does suck there. And everywhere you go, there's a picture of the dictator on the wall, and no one's allowed to talk. I remember I used to criticize Saddam Hussein in front of my aunt. She would go crazy. It was like there was somebody waiting there, listening, potentially to kill us. And that same feeling was in Syria and many other places. And so when you see the condition of the country, and then the idea that you can't even criticize the leader, and it's understandable why there would be, this type of uprising. So I think that it was organic.
No. So I think civil unrest to an extent makes sense. I don't believe it was organic. It was basically something that, as you said, there were them kids of the elite who were basically protesting. And then it was perpetuated significantly by the media, by people who had influence on the country, external countries, as well as certain scholars within the country.
That's certainly possible, and I don't discount that.
And a certain clergy within the country who basically propelled it and made it inorganic and basically perpetuated it to happen. In terms of what you're saying about the leaders, look, there's no denying that many of these countries, you can't speak ill of the leaders, right? And even the countries that America has very good deals with, UAE, Saudi, it's the same, right? You can't speak ill about these leaders, right? Now, that's the way they run their country. That's the way they want to frame their free speech. I wouldn't live in that country, right? But we're right now in countries where we don't have complete free speech as well. If you're in Germany, you can't deny the Holocaust. Now in America, you guys are going to be not even allowed to say that the Jews killed Jesus. You guys are not going to be allowed to say that basically Jews run the media. You're not allowed to say that, for example, people are Israel first. How is that any worse than these criticizing the leader? This is one individual leader. You're not able to criticize the people who control your governments.
Yeah.
And so
I agree with the spirit of what you're saying.
Yeah.
I just think there is a big difference though. Like it's getting bad in America, but I'm not going to I'm not going to be arrested by secret police for cracking a joke about Joe Biden, where that potential was very real for if you said that openly about Bashar al-Assad or Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
You'd be tortured. I have relatives in Iraq who are Kurdish, and this is for different reasons, but their siblings were murdered by the regime. Yeah. Like they literally had to go collect their loved ones' bones from bags. Like they open the bag, drop the bones, and say, "Find your loved ones, put them back together." And
I don't condone that, so I don't want it to come across as like me defending these behaviors, because there's a reason why I love living in the West. There's a reason I love living in the UK. There's a reason why I was even considering coming to America, because we have freedoms that those other countries don't have, right? But then at the same time, that's not good enough to try and cause upheaval and destruction in those countries.
Yeah,
and we have our own problems. What about Guantanamo Bay? Like literally people being tortured. They've never ever had a trial. They've never ever had the legal process, and they are literally being waterboarded.
This is wrong. I agree with you. My whole thing is just, I think my position, to clarify, I think on Syria, is that I do think it was organic, but I agree that it quickly became inorganic and was exploited and hijacked. And I agree with you that in the end, because when you look at the people who were asking for...
Your position same as Hinkle, isn't it? Because I heard him on your show saying that. But I don't think so. I think it was inorganic very early on. That's where I differ with both of you guys. I think it was very inorganic very early on. There was this kind of need to destroy Syria. And I do, just coming back to, because I didn't even answer your question on that when you look at Bashar and you look at Israeli media and Israeli comments, it was their objective and Syria was a problem. And Bashar had been supportive of the Palestinians. I believe he'd given citizenship. I checked this 10 years ago, so I need to recheck. But I remember he'd given citizenship to like 1 million Palestinians in Syria, equal citizenship, right? So he was a problem for them, and they had to remove him. So for me, this destruction in Syria was a Zionist agenda. Now, it could be that some Sunnis just didn't understand the geopolitical aspect of it and were like, you know what, this guy, he's a Shia, we want him out. Or it could be they were thinking, you know what, he is oppressive or he is harsh and that. Whatever it may be, whatever reason, people have their own reasoning. But when you look at it now, not now, even then from a geopolitical perspective, it was literally serving the Zionist agenda. Imagine we had a strong Syria right now. I think it would have been a lot more helpful to the resistance than a not so strong Syria.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We should pivot now, I think, to Iran. I think it's a good opportunity to do so. So I hear, and I disagree with this, but I hear a lot of Sunni Muslims say Iran is in cahoots with Israel. I hear this a lot. I'm sure you do as well. They think that they are faking their opposition. And the way I look at it is the evidence that Israel and Iran are not friends is the fact that Israel keeps bombing Damascus and keeps bombing the Syrian airport and their air defenses, and they're trying to prevent Hezbollah from getting weapons. And so I understand like the resentment that like Sunni Muslims have towards groups like Hezbollah and Syria and Iran because of the Syrian revolution turned uprising, turned proxy war, turned disaster. But I think it's clear that Iran is really the only nation in the region, I think, that is opposed to the state of Israel and doing what they can to support the Palestinians in terms of armed resistance. Now, whether their intentions are pure or not doesn't really matter, in my opinion, right? At the end of the day, the Palestinians are getting what they need to resist. How do you view Iran?
So, Iran's interesting because we know that America and the West has meddled in Iran for a very long time, and Britain as well, has meddled in Iran for a very long time, from the early 1900s, right? 1800s, 19th century, when, when there was this hope that there was oil in that country. And then at that time, they made a deal with the Shah of Iran, or the guy, not the Shah, the guy in charge of Iran. I forgot his name now, but basically it was a deal like, let me look for oil in your country. Anything, I'll give you a set amount, and then anything I find, you will get 18%, and we'll get 82%. So literally, even oil in Iran at that time, you'd only get 18% of it. So we've seen Western intervention in Iran for a significant period of time. And what's interesting about Iran is, Iran's always kind of had this kind of need or want for democracy. So if you look at the 50s, it was actually a democratic rule, right? And it was a democracy. And who overthrew the democracy? It was America, right?
Yeah.
So they literally went into that country in the 50s, destroyed democracy because they wanted their own control in there. So the reason I'm explaining this is America's interaction with Iran was never about democracy. It's about having control of that region, which they've had for a long time, right? Britain had control. America kind of said, don't worry, we'll sort it out for you. And then they took control of it, right? And then they're the ones who put the Shahs in charge, right? The monarchists. I know PBD loves the monarchists, and if he wants a debate about it, we're ready for it. But we know, and I'm in Miami if he wants it, but he's not gonna do it, right? Because he knows he wants people who are not very smart on these issues or aren't aware of it. But anyway, they put the monarchists in charge, and then the monarchists, what they were basically full on pro-Zio, they were full on pro-America. But then what America's tried to do was imprint their own psychology onto the country. So they start encouraging them, right, to put a printing press in place. And the irony of that was, and it kind of adds to these people who argue that not all cultures are the same. Because where we are pretty cool with the printing press is caused the collapse of Iran, didn't it? Because as soon as they put the printing press in place and people were able to air their opinions against the monarchists, it basically caused a rebellion and revolution in the country, and they overthrew the monarchists. And then they basically took a significant amount of wealth from that country and took it to America. So these monarchists, they're just completely ridiculous, because what they are is basically an American proxy. They become a vassal state of America. And then obviously it was America who wanted the country to be moved more towards the religious direction at that point, because they wanted something different to what was already there. Because normally when you want to overthrow a certain a government based on a certain ideology, you'll go for something which is either extremely different or significantly different. And hence why basically they kind of helped propel it towards a more religious direction, and hence, and then later it became where they didn't end up becoming friends with America. They no longer kowtowed to the demand. So that's the real reason why that's part of the reason why these countries have always had this kind of focus on in Iran. And then remember them students who basically exposed in the 80s the fact that America had overthrown the democratic Iranian government, because they denied it for so long. Coming back to it, now Iran, why is it important, is for that reason. So it is because America and Britain, initially Britain, later America, always had interest in Iran, but also from a geopolitical perspective, it's in Israel's interest to ensure that that entire region is destabilized, because when that region is destabilized, they kind of have certain levels of control over it, which they are. So Iran's never going to be America's friend unless they become an American vassal state or they become a Zionist vassal state. So the sheer fact that they're not that, again, indicates that they're not controlled by America, because Iran always was controlled by America, Britain for hundreds of years, right? Coming back to it, so that's one argument against it. Another argument against it is the fact that when you look at Iran itself, they've had significant embargoes on it, significant, if you look at the way America has treated Iran and the West and NATO, they've put so much restrictions on that country. If they were basically in cahoots, you would never have that. You would allow them to prosper, right? And now coming back to it, the reason why they make this argument in reality is because of sectarian reasons. Unfortunately, and this is why I've been against both sides in this regard. When they say, oh, you can only be pro-Iran to be pro-Palestine, you're taking all the Sunnis out, or a large proportion of Sunnis out, or you can only be Iran is in cahoots with the Zionists because really it's an attack on Shias because you're trying to be sectarian. In reality, when you look at Iran, Syria, all these countries, yes, they are Shia. I've told you my position on Bashar. I'm not sure if he is or not. But what you do know is that these people have been significantly pushing back against the Zionists. They have been financially supporting the resistance. Hamas has come out. The resistance has come out. Not just Hamas. A significant proportion of the resistance has come out and thanked Iran for their support in Palestine. So I don't think that this is fake. Now, in terms of what happened recently, I do think that interaction wasn't fake, but was broadcasted so that it doesn't escalate.
Carefully orchestrated.
Yeah, it was all broadcast. It was broadcast so it doesn't escalate. So, for example, the fact that for example, American intelligence were aware of it. The fact that everyone knew everyone knew it so much that I thought, no way are they going to attack.
Yeah.
I actually thought that they won't attack because it would broadcast to every single country. So you basically tell someone, guess what, I'm going to punch you. And you literally let everyone know, and then you've got your guards, your bodyguards, everyone ready for me. That's literally what happened. So that demonstrates that they were going to respond, but they wanted to make sure that it was minimized and it didn't escalate. Yeah. So yeah, there was this intention not to escalate for sure.
Yeah, which is very interesting that countries do that. I think people look at that and they don't understand why Iran would need to orchestrate that. And I pointed that out in a tweet. I maybe didn't use the best language, but I got some blowback from people. They're like, like pro-Hezbollah, pro-Iran. And they thought I'm like criticizing Iran. Like, oh, you're saying it's fake. I'm not saying it's fake. I'm just saying it's well choreographed and orchestrated as you described, so it doesn't escalate. And I
don't think it was choreographed, because and I've just been trying to be, and I know you don't mean that, but I'm just trying to be precise with the terminology, because choreographed means, or kind of gives this kind of indication that they worked with it with Israel and America. I'm saying it was broadcast. So they made everyone aware of it so that when it happened, there wasn't so much destruction that there would be World War III.
Right.
So they broadcast it, but they didn't like choreograph it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Perhaps that's the wrong word to use, and I did it on the tweet as well, which caused confusion, so I appreciate you doing that. But yeah, they let all their neighbors know, like you said, and those neighbors obviously are going to let the state of Israel, like they let Jordan know. Yeah. Hey, we're going to be sending something over your airspace. Of course, Jordan's going to tell the United States and the state of Israel,
and allow them to use the airspace as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I guess if you could comment on how in geopolitics sometimes that sort of thing needs to take place. Like Iran needs to respond. They need to save face. They also need to show strength to establish deterrence, but they also don't need it to escalate further, because that's not good for anyone. And
you saw that with both responses. So when you look at Iran's response, it was significantly broadcast, right? It was broadcast to an extent that I actually wrote a long tweet as well, saying they ain't gonna attack. Like, no way they're gonna attack in 48 hours, because like, why would you broadcast to everybody unless you weren't gonna do nothing? Or what we saw, which is that you wanted it to be minimal damage, but demonstrating your strength, that you have got the ability to respond, but you're not going to allow it to escalate to World War III. And then you saw that same thing with the Israeli response, which was extremely minimal, to the extent where Israel are like, yeah, we responded, and Iran are like, literally nothing happened. So that de-escalated the entire situation. And that was needed because Iran had two choices. They go to war with the West, which isn't the prime time to do so right now, because right now they're building their country to an extent to become strong enough that they can have significant impact in the Middle East. And so the only reason they would do that is based on emotion. And it shows that they made a logical, rational decision rather than make a decision based on emotions. But look, like, for example, when you got attacked, this is the issue that I have, that both sides, and this is why people have always kind of disliked my positions, because I've never been part of the left from a political, or the right. I'm not pro-America, pro-NATO, but I'm not pro-Russia, pro-China, just because Putin says something, I'm not going to agree with it automatically. Similarly, from a religious perspective, I don't hold one position on any kind of position. So I'm like anti-sectarian. So some of my positions are diverse. And like you saw that on Fresh and Fit yesterday. So because I've always been like, I don't want some other person to control my mind. My mind has been given by God, and I'm going to make it autonomous, and I'm going to think about things individually. So like, for example, and why I'm talking about this as well, I think it's a prime time to talk about, is Russia, right? So if you look at a lot of my positions, they kind of will align with the Russian position, but that's not because it's the Russian position, but just that they're on the right on a lot of these issues. But if Putin was to do something that was against my position, let's say Putin was to attack Islam or do something like that, I would be the first person against him, right? Because I don't have allegiance to one man. I have allegiance to the truth. But if you look at it from, like, so I'm just going to talk about some of these points because they are discussed and it's a chance to talk about it because it's kind of like a geopolitical podcast. Like Kosovo, right? So my position on Kosovo is that that was created by the West for NATO interests, right? To cause upheaval in that region, right? So Kosovo shouldn't be a separate country. But at the same time, some people have claimed that they want the ethnic cleansing of Muslims and to make it into a Christian nation. So I'm against that as well, because I'm against ethnic cleansing of anyone, right? So this is like an example of where you're not holding either, you're basically, you've got like a distinct position. Or for example, when you look at Yugoslavia, right? For me, Yugoslavia, Milosevic ran that country as best he could based on the dynamics. Because if you think about Yugoslavia, it had a wide range of nationalities. It had a wide range of religions. And yet he was able to ensure the country didn't get destroyed. And this is the reason why the West wanted to destroy it, right? So if you look at Milosevic's control of that country until like 91, I believe, he basically ran it really well under the circumstances. And then that was the reason that they wanted to destroy it and cause this kind of destruction in that country. Or for example, let's take Bosnia as an example. Bosnia is a good example of me not taking the narrative of either side, because I do think that Bosnians kind of were a bit preemptive in some of their actions, right, in terms of what they acted. But then the response in terms of what happened was completely disproportionate. And so I do believe that the Bosnians did face oppression, that there was a genocide. So this is not the Russian, and I mean, when I say the Russian narrative, I mean the people who are pro-Russian, their narrative, I do believe that they were oppressed. But then at the same time, it was, again, Western NATO interest to have that situation where the countries were split up. But separate to that, if you look at Bosnians, NATO waited a significant period of time on purpose, in my view, to allow as much people to die as possible. And on top of that, you basically have it now. What have they got? They've basically got like a third of the country, and a third of, and then even more than that, they only have control of the country like a third of the time. So it's not like the Bosnians had, the America or NATO had the Bosnians' interest. The only reason they did that was to cause upheaval. And I guess from Serbia's perspective, because of like the impact that they had over Ottoman rule, right, the way the Ottomans treated them, they do have this kind of, in my view, personal hatred towards Muslims. I've been to Serbia, and I would say, from I know it's anecdotal, but from a personal perspective, it's probably one of the most racist countries I've been to in my life, and I've traveled a lot. So Serbians do have that as well. So, like, again, why I'm giving this example is, myself, I'm not somebody who just follows one leader just because he's that leader. I'm not pro-China just because it's China. I'm not pro-Russia because it's pro-Russia. But because our guide, or my guide, is basically the Quran and what I believe is the authentic Sunnah, right? Which is probably different to what some of the people believe is the authentic Sunnah, right? But those are my guides. So my guide isn't like some Western leader right now, or some Eastern leader, or some Balkan leader, or whatever it may be, right? And so that's where we differ. I just wanted to say that because these questions have been coming up on social media quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's important to clarify. And I think maybe not to the extent that you get it, but I get criticized just for like talking to people like you or Jackson Hinkle, for example. So there's a lot of Syrians who hate Bashar who follow our page because they appreciate the content we've done on Palestine. Yeah. And I love them and I respect them for that. And I'm appreciative for anyone who supports my work. At the same time, though, I don't like being told I can't talk to someone.
Yeah.
Even if I disagree with them, I'm going to talk to you and I'm going to learn from you. And then they'll say annoying things like, oh, so you talk to a Zionist? It's like, well, I guess it depends, maybe. It depends what we're talking about and who's leading the conversation and what the purpose is. But, if we agree on certain things like Palestine, for example, then yeah, I want to talk to you and I want to hear your perspective. So,
but just on that, right? Look, at the end of the day, I've got very, very close friends who are anti-Bashar. Like extremely close friends who are anti-Bashar, right? And that's fine, because I don't think, and I know they're not doing it because they're Zionist controlled. they're doing it more, they believe in that position more because of their dislike of Bashar and how what they believe is how he ran that country. And that's fine. I'm looking at it from a completely holistic perspective. I looked at it initially, like I said, from a religious perspective, and later, and also from a geopolitical perspective, although I didn't write about it. But it's fine. Like, I don't think that people should like lose their minds over this issue. But I do think, and I wouldn't call them Zionists, but I do think that the destruction of Syria was for the Zionists. But again, look, I have fans or supporters who literally, actually most of my supporters, most of the people who follow me are anti-Bashar. So when they hear this podcast and I've gone into so much detail, I'll probably lose a large number of followers.
Yeah,
but look,
you're gonna have some fun with the comments.
Yeah, but it is what it is.
So let's talk about the college campuses.
Yeah.
It started with Columbia. It may not have started there, but that's where the media attention came. They started occupying the college campus, and they did so because they're demanding that the university divest. Now, I don't know specifically what they're calling for divestment this time. I just know broadly they want them to divest from Israel, right? But oftentimes what that looks like is divesting from American corporations, meaning military-industrial complex like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Caterpillar, right? These are companies that produce militarized bulldozers that the IDF used to destroy Palestinian homes. It's being used right now in Gaza to destroy homes. HP, another American company that produces the biometric identification systems, which are used at the checkpoints. Palestinians scan their thumb. The Israelis have them in a registry, and then they either allow them or deny them to, move across Palestinian land through these checkpoints. So when I was in college 10 years ago, we called for a divestment movement, and we investigated our university's investments. And I bring this up briefly. I don't want to take too much time because I know that you have a lot to say about this. But I think it's important because one of the things people are calling for is disclose and divest. So they want the university to disclose their investments. One of the reasons why they stopped disclosing, which basically means reporting every year, here's a report on how our investments did. And they wouldn't tell you specifically who they invest in, like which corporation. They just tell you the investment pool or fund. And then you could look up that fund and you would see, oh, okay, Caterpillar is on their list, for example. The reason why they stopped disclosing is because of student groups that I was part of and others around the country. They had done the research. And so we, I guess, laid a lot of the groundwork, about a decade ago. But obviously the university rejected us when we pointed out. We even discovered that our university was invested in Iran indirectly through a Chinese company, which is a violation of the sanctions that the U.S. applied on Iran. And they didn't care. They're like, we don't even want to talk about divestment. So they stopped disclosing. So now these universities, we're starting to see these protests spread across the country, and we've seen the violence now at UCLA where these pro-Israel thugs attacked the Palestinian encampment and the police just watched, which is outrageous. What do you make of this situation?
So I talked about this yesterday on the podcast, so and I'll reiterate some of the points, but then I'll add some more. So what we're seeing on the college campuses from a holistic perspective is, in my view, the most American thing that you can do. And this is the greatest irony, because the right has been conditioned into and manipulated by the Zionist-controlled media into thinking that as soon as they see someone protest, they lose their minds. Oh, they're blocking off a highway, we're going to lose our minds. Oh, they're doing this, we're going to lose our minds. So they lose their minds over the smallest level of protest. The greatest irony when they support the Jan 6 protest, right? And this is the difference, because we're consistent, right? So we support all protest. Now, coming back to it, why is it the most American thing? Just look at American history. So how did America start? It started with the protesting the Brits, throwing them out, rebelling against them, and then taking control of the country, right?
In response to what? No taxation without representation,
exactly.
Right? They just didn't like being taxed, and they overthrew the king for it, right?
Exactly. So that's how it started. And then you look at, for example, and I gave this example yesterday, you look at slavery. How did slavery end? It started with a rebellion. So there was a white Christian guy. His name was John Brown. I like to mention him because most Americans either don't know about him or they forgot about him. John Brown, who basically was a very strict Christian. And initially he started protesting by speaking to people. So it was verbal protest, right? He'd be like, look, plantation owners, look, what you're doing to these slaves is not right. Like, you're basically oppressing them, you're treating them as like subhuman. That didn't work. And so he started escalating. He started having town halls. That didn't work. And then he started escalating to the point where he took on the US government, right? So he went to Vermont. He went to Vermont and he took over the armory
I think it's Harper's Ferry, Virginia.
Oh, sorry, Virginia. That's right. Yeah, Virginia.
Yeah, I know this because in one of the early videos we did about October 7th, which was "Do you condemn armed resistance?" we included this story.
Oh, did you?
America's
brilliant.
First terrorist.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. So Virginia. Sorry, you're right. Virginia. Yeah. So he took over Virginia. It was an armory, right? And he sacrificed his children for the armory. And the reason they got caught was because what happened earlier on was, in his initial part of his resistance, was that he would help slaves out of plantations. And so he would help slaves out of the plantation. And one of the slaves, what happened was she had a significant damage to her brain because she'd had significant impact to it because of the oppression that she'd been facing. So she was kind of mentally a little bit unstable because of that. And when they were basically planning to take over the armory in Virginia, she made a few errors and she let a few people know because of a mental health condition that she had. And what happened? His family got killed. Who's the very first person to receive the death penalty because he took on the US government. And he was the start of the end of slavery because Frederick Douglass had met him and he had significant impact on Frederick Douglass, so he, in my view, was the start of the end of the slavery. And then you guys had, for example, Rosa Parks, who again resisted. And then you had people who resisted in the Vietnam War. And it was college students. So American history is entrenched with protesting and causing change. And yet the media has made people think, oh, why are they protesting? Why are they shutting off highways? And it's both from the right and the left who are making the same argument. Even people who are pro-Palestine are complaining about this, and I think, what? They're like, it's so un-American. It's not. It's the most American. It's just the Zionist-controlled media has made you think it's un-American. Why? Because who are you going to protest against? You're going to protest against the government. Who controls the government? It's the Zionists. So what they want is the laity not to protest against them. And that's why they've conditioned their minds into thinking that you can't protest. So that's the reality of the situation. Now, coming back to it, when you look at the students, they've done the most American thing there is, which is to protest against power. And if you look at the movement, there's people who from the Jewish community there, there's people from the left there, there's people from the right there. Now, some of these people are saying, oh, it's Soros funded. First of all, please provide the specific evidence that it is Soros funded, right? Because again, that's a way to malign and make this into a leftist issue. Yeah. And because what people then do is make the link to BLM, right?
Yeah, and it's a way to strip away, this isn't organic.
Exactly.
So yesterday I was at a protest at USF, University of South Florida, where I went. And I saw there were Jewish Zionists on campus who came to watch. Yeah. Maybe 10 or 12 of them. Young guys, they're like 22. So I went up to them and I had my camera, so they thought I was with the media. They're like, oh, are you with the media? I was like, no, I'm with them. They're like, them? Like the Palestinians? I was like, yeah, I'm with them. They're like, so what do you want with us? I was like, I just want to talk to you guys. I want to know what you think.
Awesome.
And they felt like some of them were being nice. Some of them I could tell felt really uncomfortable. Like, why do you want to talk to us? I wanted to hear from them, and I didn't realize this is the day after UCLA. So why are they here? Are they here to cause trouble? I don't know, and I'm not saying they were, but I thought it was interesting, and I went up to talk to them. And one of them said, he wouldn't look at me, but he muttered to me, "How much are they paying you to be here?" I said, well, contrary to popular belief, we're not funded by Qatar. We're here because we're passionate about this, and just because you disagree with us doesn't mean this is some conspiracy where we're being funded. So, to your point, going back to, I think, the American Revolution, that's such a great example, and I use that all the time. Think about what they did. The Boston Tea Party, they didn't like being taxed on tea because the idea was that the 7 Years' War was very expensive. The British defeated the French, and they inherited all this land in North America, which was a great victory for them, but they had a lot of debt. Who's going to pay the debt? The colonists are. We're going to increase taxes on them, but we're not going to give you representation in Parliament. So that was the cry they had. No taxation without representation. Americans felt so strongly about that. They weren't being oppressed. In that way they were, but they weren't being tortured and killed or put in concentration camps or on a calorie count. They're being taxed, and they're not given a voice in Parliament. What did Americans do? They went to the harbor, right? And there's disagreement over how true the story is. It's exaggerated oftentimes. But they basically, took the tea, right? And they dumped it into the ocean. They did. Americans felt like you can't tax us without representation. That's unfair. We're going to destroy property for it. We're going to occupy the harbor. And if need be, we'll pick up guns and fight back. Okay. So you're a Palestinian American and you go to college, and the university you pay tuition to invests part of your tuition into the corporations that are dropping bombs and killing your family members. and you start with a referendum or a petition, which is how all these divestment movements started. Like our campus, we started with a petition, collected signatures. We submitted to the university, hey, look how many people support divestment. Will you divest? No. Okay. Here's a referendum. Students are voting. Majority of the students voted. They want you to divest. Will you divest? No. Okay. Here's a resolution in student government. The students have voiced their opinion. They want divestment. Will you divest? No. What do you do after that? At some point, you go to the harbor, you grab the tea, and you dump it in the ocean. That's what's happening on these college campuses. They're occupying the halls, and they're saying, you've pushed us to this point. You have put us in this position where we have no other choice but to get your attention.
100%. And so that's how it started, right? And what's happened is, with anything, it causes a cascading effect. So when one university rises up and they gets the media or social media attention, then it allows other universities to say, look, we're in a similar situation, we're gonna rise up. This entire thing has been extremely organic. I know this because in the United Kingdom, I know that the people who've been involved and have started it, it's completely organic. They were just waiting for the exam season to be over, and then they basically started it. But it's completely organic. Now, in terms of when you look at what they want, as you said, what is it if you look, first of all, look at the people involved. You basically got, mainly people from the left, but it's actually people from the right as well. It's people from all communities, Jewish, and this is why they try to make it into like anti-Semitism. But in reality, you've got a significant Jewish bloc in there, you've got a Christian bloc in there, and then you've got a Muslim and atheistic, and people from wide range of religions in there. The reason they want to do this is because they want to make it into a leftist issue, because to basically condition the right into thinking that, look, it's just the same BLM people, but it's not. And in reality, as you said, it's extremely organic. And what's interesting is they've tried their best into making this into like an anti-Semitic attack. But in reality, there's been nothing that has been anti-Semitic about it. I'm not even seeing one incident. There might be one or two incidents, but I'm not seeing any incidences of a real anti-Semitism. And if it is, they'd be called out. There was, for example, the video of there was a chain of people who looked like they were stopping this Jewish student from entering the campus. I was like, that's wrong, right? But then I found a video where it actually shows that Jewish student had physically assaulted people in the campus. And this was a consequence that they didn't want the student to go into the same situation, because then there would have been a fight. Right. So a lot of this has been debunked. There was a woman who claimed that someone hit her with a flag, and we saw the video, and literally a person was walking by, no one even touched her.
No one touched her. And she got on TV the next day.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the level of propaganda and fake news that happened. But in reality, what you mentioned is the other way around. There was people at UCLA, Zionists, who physically attacked, and after crying victim for weeks, they're the ones who physically attacked pro-Palestinian protests in a very physical, harsh manner, and the police allowed it. So in reality, we know and there's also videos of like the police working with the Zionists to throw the Palestinians out. So again, when you're seeing this, we know who the police are with, we know who the people in power are with, and we know who the governments are with. It's interesting as well that when it came to the BLM riots, they allowed them to perpetuate for a very long time, right? They were burning up cars and doing everything, right? And nothing happened. And yet on this peaceful protest, and students are getting dragged out, professors are being physically assaulted. There was an old philosophy professor, and she was like physically thrown to the ground and physically assaulted. Like, imagine, that's an American woman. That's an American grandma. Imagine that happening to you, and it's done for a foreign nation. It's completely ridiculous, because the whole point is this. I know you said it's about divestment, but in reality, when you've got people like Netanyahu speaking out against the protests, it tells you the level of impact it's having on them. They severely, significantly want it to end.
Oh, they feel incredibly threatened by it, because this is how, divestment alone is not what destroyed South African apartheid. There are greater forces like sanctions and a whole bunch of other things. But a key stream that combined into this river that destroyed South African apartheid was divestment taking place en masse from different universities. If Columbia University divested, that's the domino, and every single university in the country will follow suit.
But more than that, I think with this, it's not just the divestment now. It's become it's become a symbol. It's become a symbol of the youth of America, that they are against the Zionist control. And because of that, they have a panic attack. And then when this is moving into Europe and moving throughout the world, this is the real fear. And it's the reason why the resistance has been praising it. These protests have no relevance. If people say protests don't make a difference, which I know people who are part of, I think it's Hinkle's crew or maybe who are against the protests. The people who are saying that protests don't make a difference, they make a huge difference. There's a reason why the resistance is supporting it and Netanyahu's crying about it, because they're seeing in real time the future of America, and the future of America isn't Zionist control. And so hence why they put in laws in place to control the mind of students and the youth, to ensure that they're not basically speaking out against it. So I'm significantly for the protests, significantly support it. We don't know if they are really inorganic. I've not seen real evidence of this.
They're organic, bro.
Yeah, they're completely organic.
I was part of it. Anyway, I usually don't get offended very easily.
Yeah.
But when people say it's inorganic, I get really offended because I spent years of my life doing this. My sister will tell you.
Yeah.
I gave up way too much time, right, doing this for somebody to say this is inorganic. No, this is organic.
So what do you say to people who say, I know you're meant to be interviewing me, but let me ask you the question because now you're...
No, go ahead.
What do you say to people who say that this is like Soros controlled or Soros backed?
Which is the main argument. It, George Soros is, if I'm not mistaken, a Jewish Zionist. So I don't understand why he would be funding...
Well, he's Jewish. I mean, there's a disagreement whether he's a Zionist or not.
From what I've heard, I could be mistaken, but from what I've heard, he's a Zionist. Well, so assuming that he is. Now, if he isn't, I can tell you from a personal experience, and I know that this is not maybe evidence that people can consider broadly, right? But my personal experience is that me and my friends did loads of organizing. I mean, we blocked the port of Tampa once, preventing an Israeli ship from unloading their goods. The company Zim, Z-I-M. They were coming to Tampa, and we wanted to prevent them from unloading, so we organized a demonstration. That was our time. We did. Any money spent came from our own pockets. We did that because we passionately believe in this cause. Palestine should be free. We don't have a problem. It's not like if you ask me whether I like the idea that Israel exists and all the Palestinians from 1948 lost their land. No, I don't like that. I would like to see Palestine in its entirety. But is it up to me? No. Is Israel going anywhere? No. So if they're going to be here, can they live peacefully and coexist with the Palestinians? We're open to that. We have no problem with that. We just don't want to see apartheid. We don't want to see military occupation. We don't want to see what you're doing in Gaza. And we're passionate enough about that. And we're privileged enough to live in America where we have the connections, the resources, the ability to protest and to speak, and the free time to put our energy into organizing these movements. And so that's all I can really tell you. I mean, in terms of, like, I've seen Visegrad and these other, libs of TikTok posted about trying to draw a connection between Soros and these protests. I didn't see a very strong argument, and so I don't know if you have, but I think
I've not seen it. They're trying to make it look like some of these smaller blocks that are also in there, that they are Soros backed, right?
Yeah, so there's potential that they receive grants, but these kids operate autonomous. These kids think for themselves, and I can tell you, just going to Emory University and seeing the way, like, they didn't even want to partake in an event that had police. They think for themselves. They're, in some cases, ideological purists, right? But they're well-intentioned, good people, and they don't take orders from George Soros.
And what's interesting is that, for me, they see these protests as such a threat that yesterday they put a bill in to stop this from ever happening. They want to control speech to stop this from happening. So if this really was something negative, why are the Zionists so passionate about it that they are flagrantly disregarding the First Amendment? It demonstrates that this is having a huge impact on America, and it's exposing Zionists more than ever. So for me, I'm hugely in support of these protests, because not only from a divestment perspective, but from a holistic ideological perspective, it is extremely exposing Zionists more than ever.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have for time. Sulaiman, I want to thank you so much for being here. I love the conversation that we had. I hope we get to have this again one day. Perhaps I'll come to you in the UK, or if you're ever back in town, we'll definitely do it. And maybe we can hop in on a Twitter space together one day.
Definitely, sounds great.
But it's been such a great conversation. And I look forward to seeing more of your excellent work on X.
I appreciate having me. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you for your patience, man.
Trust nothing. No lies.